Good evening and welcome to the live stream of the podcast. Today, I am really excited about our guest. And joining us is Ioan Grillo, all the way from Mexico City. Ioan is a longtime friend who has been living down in Mexico for about 20 years now. And he's been covering the cartels all that time. So, Ioan has a very unique perspective of what goes on in the world of illicit drugs. And he has a great book out that is available at Amazon, at Barnes and Nobles, and the bookshop. And I'm going to show you a quick copy of it. It's right here. It's Blood, Gun, Money. This book, I started reading it last week when it came in the mail. And from the first chapter, you are completely hooked. And I don't want to give too much away, but it starts with the guns of El Chapo. And if you live in New York City, you know that a couple of years ago, El Chapo was brought to New York to go on trial. And he was specifically in Brooklyn, not too far from Sunset Park, the neighborhood that I live in. And there was this big, almost welcoming of El Chapo to Sunset Park, where there was people who went out to the jail. It's a federal prison in Sunset Park. And they basically had bandas playing outside across the street in this jail, welcoming El Chapo. And Ioan in the first chapter talks about the trial. So I'm super excited to bring on my good friend, Ioan Grillo. ¿Cómo estás? How you doing?
Bien, great to be here, Rob. Good to see you again.
Thank you so much for being here. So El Chapo and his guns and all the guns that these cartels use in and everything that they work in, if we could call it that, come from the United States.
Yeah.
How is that? Like how do these guns make it down there?
Yeah, so what you have in the United States is you have the biggest firearms retail market in the world by far. It's got, the last count was 393 million guns in civilians' hands, which is more than the next 25 countries combined. And you've also got, alongside the retail market, a parallel black market, an illegal market of firearms moving around the United States, going to places like New York, Baltimore, Washington, Chicago, but also this huge suction of them going south of the border. Now, the numbers are insane, that we know have been taken from cartel members, criminals, traced back to the United States, shops, factories, 164,000 in the last 12 years. But they believe that's the tip of the iceberg, and it's more likely more than 2 million guns in that time. So an iron river of firearms going down, and this crazy conflict, insane levels of violence playing out here, that just doesn't seem to stop.
Yeah, that's a very unique term, right? The river, right? Like a river of firearms making their way down to Mexico. Like that is such a unique way to put it. And it's like a river making its way down there. It's incredible. Like so the United States is 300 million people.
Yeah.
So there's basically a gun for every American living in the United States. That's insane, right? And we also have a lot of issues with that, right? We have mass shootings in schools, which, interestingly enough, since the pandemic, we've had no mass shootings.
Yeah,
It's fucking incredible, right? To think that it took a pandemic to cease fire when it comes to these mass shootings in schools. And also, I guess the amount of drugs that's consumed in the United States, it's amazing. So I read this interesting statistic where the United States, right, 300 million people make up about 5% of the world's population. It's tiny. Think about it. How many people live on this planet? And the US only makes up about 5% of that. Yet the US consumes about 87% of the world's illegal drugs. Like, how is that possible? There's a huge drug addiction problem in the United States. And I think that perhaps maybe that is the way to go, right? Like, I think these governments should address the addiction problem more so than like the war on drugs, or this famous war on drugs term that we keep hearing. And I think it's more like a psychological thing. There's so many factors to that, and I can understand why people, become addicted to drugs, right? I have this very weird, funky experience where a few years ago I had a wisdom tooth pulled. And my dentist is a really cool guy. I really like him because he's really fun. We have great conversation every time I'm in his office. He's just to set it up for you, right? He's about 6'4", 6'5", really big, muscular dude, in shape. If you saw him on the street, you wouldn't think he's a dentist, right? You would think he plays bass in a heavy metal band because he's got like this cool hair. He's all tatted up. His Harley, he parks in front of the office, and he wears like these big boots, like big rocker boots. And I was in there and I was like, I needed a wisdom tooth pulled. And I was like, I prefer to be under, so it'll be easier for him and it'll be easier for me. And he's like, okay, great. Let me I'm going to prepare your cocktail. And I don't know what he put together, but he prepares it. He's got a bunch of little vials and he's setting the syringe. He puts the rubber thing in my arm and basically pokes me with the needle. And I can feel the fluid, the liquid going into my veins. And the minute it goes into my bloodstream, I begin to feel like this really cool heaviness. And then I just kind of go out. But in the middle of it, all this, like, now that I think back, I had a trip. I was tripping. I was high as a freaking kite. And I saw colors. I saw spirally things. I saw beautiful scenery. I heard music. I heard angels. It was, and I think the whole thing it went by so quickly. Like, it felt like it was seconds, but it was the most amazing sensation, feelings, euphoria I've ever felt, that it totally messed with my mind afterwards, because I was like I kept thinking about it for days because I really enjoyed it. And I'm almost grateful that I had that experience. And luckily it's not something that like, oh, I can't wait to have it again. I'm just kind of grateful that I had that feeling, right? Because I was thinking this must be what it feels like to like maybe try heroin or anything like that. And I saw this other unique statistic where there's a big addiction here in the States with painkillers. And it's usually the dentists who prescribe these painkillers.
Yeah, I mean, one of the characters in the book I interviewed or have a profile of is a guy from New England, Billy Jack Curtis, and he got hooked on drugs when he was in military intelligence, and he was caddying for an officer who was also a dentist and was giving him some dental treatment, and he got him hooked on dental drugs then, and that's how he got hooked. And then he actually went on to become, which is a big part of the illegal gun trade, is so connected to the drug trade. I mean, this is like just wound up together: drugs and guns, drugs and guns, drugs and guns. So he was bringing guns in from Maine to a city in Massachusetts, and trading the guns with Dominican gangsters for drugs, heroin and coke, and then take them back. So it's this really bouncy, the way that these prices work, and you get this kind of crazy, economics of the black market of drugs and guns. These Dominicans were going to New York and getting the heroin and coke in New York with goods, so they're getting it cheap. They're bringing it and bouncing to him. He's getting the guns cheap, and they're all marking up the prices. So he would, like, for example, get a gun from some junkie in small town Maine, gets that like real cheap, and then he exchanges that for one little amount of heroin, and then he goes back and it like quadruples his money very, very fast. It's like these crazy elastic prices with these fingers of heroin and this coke, and that's kind of how part of the gun drug market works.
It's incredible, completely fascinating that it's a if you had to put a dollar value on that industry of illegal drugs, like what is that industry worth, if we can call it
So
industry?
yeah, absolutely, yeah. So you've got these numbers now. All the numbers. The problem is with illegal black markets is there's no good numbers because it's we don't have the receipts. But there's a survey done by the White House called "What Do Americans Spend on Illegal Drugs?" And that survey, which kind of estimates based on their estimates of how many users there are of illegal drugs and how much they spend, and they've got a bunch of like equations around it. It's commissioned by the Rand Institute, and they estimate it's $150 billion every year that Americans spend on illegal drugs. So that's bigger than, it's a lot bigger than the book industry. It's a lot bigger than a lot of things. Now, the United Nations have their own idea. They say that the global drug market is worth about $300 billion, worth north of $300 billion. Europe has really caught up a lot in drug consumption and spending these days. I mean, now, England, Spain, Italy, huge amounts of cocaine being taken, heroins have been big for a long time. So you've got Europe as well, big there. And then Latin America, it used to be the phrase. I remember a journalist from Tijuana told me this. When I first arrived in Mexico, I used to phone him up a lot. A guy called Jesus Blanconelas, who's a legendary narco reporter out of Tijuana. And he said, Grillo, there's a phrase we have about cocaine. The Colombians make it, the Mexicans traffic it, and the gringos snort it.
Wow.
And that was true for a time, but then it's not true anymore because in Mexico, you start getting a bunch of drug users as well. And a lot of this is because the way that a lot of the time, again, it's this weird elastic things. Kia Coke's worth $2,000 in Colombia. Bounce it into Mexico, it's worth like $20,000. So you've already just put your investment up 10 times. I mean, nowhere else can do that just by getting it to Mexico before you even got to the US. So you've got somebody working for you in Mexico, these cartel members, and it's like, okay, I'll pay the guy. Now, what do you want? I can pay you money, or I'll give you a key of cocaine, which to me is worth $2,000, but to you on the street you can sell for $20,000. So they give them the key of cocaine, and then they can start unloading that, and so then that creates a lot of the drug use in Mexico. Brazil is now number 2 in the world for total cocaine consumption. And in fact, it's overtaken the US for crack consumption. Crack's gone down a bit in the US now, but it's up in Brazil. So that's where the biggest crack problem is now.
Wow. Now, has the pandemic affected business? Like, you figured it would slow down, right? Or is it, or are people getting creative and you can order, like you order, a big thing during the pandemic here in the States was like services like Grubhub, Uber Eats, and you basically order your takeout home. Like I wonder if these guys have gotten that creative where you don't have to leave your house, you can get your drugs delivered to home.
Yeah, I mean that's been around for a while in a lot of places, like phone. I mean, back in the UK, there's a lot of that in the UK. These phone networks and just like people say. But what the pandemic has done to the Mexican cartels is, if you look at the numbers of drugs being caught on the border and drugs moving up, cocaine's down a bit because there's less parties, less nightclubs, so cocaine's down a bit. But heroin and crystal meth, up. And the reason is you got a lot of people locked up, depressed, already got those opioid problems, just get worse. So you saw last year record numbers, terrible numbers of overdose deaths in the United States. Now, another flip side of this in Mexico is the cartels are still making money. But at the beginning of the pandemic, there was this big lockdown. Loads of people, broke, no furlough, no checks, just like, just get it struggling day by day. So then the cartels did these handouts. I'm sure you saw videos and heard some stories about some of those, where they go to these places, go to these communities, and hand out, and they videotape this and have a bunch of them turn up with guns and hand out these plastic bags for the groceries. So I went to a place where they'd done a handout in the state of Mexico, in one of the municipalities in the state of Mexico, big flower growing municipality. It took us all day to walk out and find the place was where they did the handout. But we found the place, and the cartel had turned up. About a couple of hundred people had lined up, and they'd received these bags. This family we talked to, they sent out a couple of the younger girls in the family, 13 and 14, to kind of go and take a bag each. Plastic bags. And the family were like, yeah, it was great. They had, sugar, milk, eggs. But they were like, they were like, yeah, they were good. It wasn't cheap. These were not like cheap brands of sugar. They were like good quality brands of sugar. For people there, poor people struggling, this was a big deal. Now, one thing about these handouts was that these were not like, if you look at the total numbers, there's a lot of struggling people. They only give a few out to a few people, but it gets publicity, so it makes them show like we're the good guys, even though we're killing a bunch of people, decapitating people, and carrying out all this mayhem. We're the good guys because we're handing out goodie bags, and they win support in these communities.
Yeah, I think which was something that I was thinking about the other day, and you mentioned it now. With all the murders and all the different, I guess, turf wars that have taken place throughout the years that affected civilians as well, that get caught in the middle of this. Do you think, or have you found that Mexican people, just regular folks, are kind of tired of it? Like, I know that for example, in music and certain culture, or like a subculture, kind of maybe looks up to these guys and they glorify them, and they look like heroes in the different corridos and some of the banda music. But are some people kind of fed up with it? Like enough, we want to kind of just enjoy life and not be afraid that if we're taking a stroll in the park, we might get caught in the middle of a gunfight.
I mean, yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, this varies so much in different parts of Mexico. I mean, Puebla, yeah, that's your family.
Yes.
Your both your parents from Puebla, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So and for a long time, it was like very peaceful there. Like we were happy because it hadn't gotten to Puebla, so you could, I'd go out to a antro and drink the night away and walk home at 4 or 5 in the morning, and I felt safe.
Yeah. I mean, and Puebla's still like being, one of the better states in Mexico. But so you varies. If you look at like I look at like Mexico in 3 parts. You got states where there really isn't cartel stuff happening much at all. I mean, like I quote this: Yucatan has got low levels of murders. It's got less, lower level of murders in Yucatan than the US. It's got the same levels as like Belgium. Like Yucatan's like peaceful. Then you got states a bit in the middle, like Mexico State, Mexico City, with some cartel stuff happening. And they got quite a few murders happening. Then you've got the states that are like hardcore in the midst of the cartel war. So it just varies so much. So when you look at the states which are in the middle of a heavy cartel conflict, which now includes Guanajuato, but also Tijuana, Baja California, Chihuahua, Sinaloa, Sonora. It's about a third of the country. Tamaulipas, Guerrero, Michoacan, all these places. In those places, you've got some people, as you say, like really fed up with this, just really fed up. Other people embracing it, or they recognize that these cartels are the power in their communities. If you're a young kid, you see this, you recognize that that's the power. It's not like, the power is not the president, the power is not the police, the power is the cartel. And you grow up recognizing that. So you respond to power. You respond to that. You want to be part of that. Especially if you're the really extreme things. And since we last talked, I think I went up to the mountains to Chapo Guzman's village, and I met his mother and his family. His cousin, stayed with his cousin, sat through a 3-hour evangelical service with his mother. And that's, I mean, you walk in that really is their land. I mean, there's them driving around on quad bikes with, ski masks and AK-47, and that's they own that place.
And that's daily life. That's just how it is.
That's daily life. So it is. You're going through. I mean, it's dirt roads, getting up there, and you go through. It's like going through a little capsule, and you're living. It's like living in occupied, guerrilla-controlled territory. I mean, that's what it really is kind of crazy. But that's kind of an exception. But you've got other places, urban areas. I mean, Ciudad Juarez. I mean, or some of them. I mean, I find some of the creepiest places in terms of the cartel stuff is Tamaulipas. It is Reynosa. The cartels everywhere, but it's not as open as the mountains of Sinaloa. But it's very, very intense feeling. But yeah, I mean, it's depressing that I've been here 20 years and I was covering this stuff. I was like covering that turf war in Tamaulipas in 2004, 2005. And thinking now, kids who were not born then are now hitmen in the cartels. Because there's hitmen who are 16. I mean, there's hitmen who were 13, 14. But there was one guy in Nuevo Laredo who became famous through songs. Now there they have like corridos, but they're like in rap. So there's the same kind of style of corridos, like telling a story about a person, but they do them to like hip hop beats, and they do this kind of rap to it. So this guy was known as Juan Pistola. and there's these raps about him, and it's like became famous from the raps, like Juan Pistola. Everyone's like, yeah. And he became a hitman like 13, 14, and then at 16, I think in 2019, like year before last, he got killed, and he literally got his face blown off by the military. It was like Juan Pistolas was killed and died at 16. But that guy was, these kids were not even born, and this stuff just goes on and on. These wars, and people just grow up and just accept it, and just like make their peace with living, living along. I mean, the Spanish word, which conviviendo, living alongside this stuff. And an example of that is, I mean, one time I was in Sinaloa, and we ran into a murder scene, literally driving right into it. And it was breakfast, a guy having breakfast, a police commander having breakfast, and they walked in with an AK-47 and just gunned him down having breakfast. We literally just drove into the scene. It was all chaotic, bodies still on the concrete, everyone screaming. It was all like a mad scene. I was with a TV crew, and we kind of filmed a bit of this scene, and then it kind of calmed down a bit. We kind of, waited to kind of still follow what's happening. And then they cleaned up the restaurant. The body was taken away. Forensic people came, took the body away. Then they cleaned up. And then they got the restaurant ready for lunch. So you could turn up for lunch. You wouldn't even know there'd been a murder there in the morning. And that's like living alongside. So every day, that's the weirdness of this. You get the weird violence happening, and then a bunch of people just like living around it. And this kind of, it's this kind of normality around it.
Do you remember the first time you walked up on a murder scene? Like, because, it's something, I'm assuming, like, for example, back in the UK, it's not something that you saw all the time, right? Or ever, that's gotta be like, whoa, because of the amount of violence involved. Like, do you remember that first time you like stepped onto like a murder scene and you're covering it?
Yeah,
sure. Your mind.
Sure. Yeah, no, totally. I mean, in the UK, I'd hardly seen dead bodies. I worked in a hospital when I was a student, and one time I carried a dead body down to the freezer, down to the, a guy who passed away. We carried him down. I remember that, but I really haven't been around dead bodies. Remember the first dead body I saw in Mexico wasn't a murder; it was a car crash. But it was just like, I remember, it was one morning I woke up to go to the shop, and there was just like a corpse just right outside my house that had been from a car crash. And I was like, but then I remember going to one of these murder scenes, and one of them was a cop in Culiacan, and we got there, and he'd had his head blown off. I mean, not blown off. He had his face had been blown off, and he was hit from his car, but he got out of the car and it was kind of on the concrete. And I remember the first time looking at that and looking at staring at at this kind of guy with his face blown off. I remember thinking it didn't look human. It looked like it was made of rubber. It was hard to kind of relate it as being a human being. It looked like I was staring at a rubber dummy, a rubber, And then the wife turned up, and the wife kind of came up and she was like screaming, ah! And so then that was like, okay, it's a human. I can see in her face the pain, the emotion. Here's somebody who's been with this guy, through everything, and she's seeing her husband on the ground like that. And that was, yeah, and that was, and I remember like going to sleep, and then I'd see that image of that blown out face in my dreams. I'd like, another thing used to catch my attention was seeing these bodies, and they'd be like, it's funny. It's a funny thing when you see these bodies that are like, they fall down from the bullets, but they're like weird positions. Like their arms are like in weird, like thrown out. It's like they've got a position somehow like looks strange. And there's something which is a bit like that gets me as well, is you see these bodies and you see like some guy who's been shot, and he's got it, and it's funny, these little details that stick with me. He's got his like belly hanging out, and there's something like humiliating, or it's like like the humiliation of the way that your body's looking in a really bad way with your belly hanging out, or your pants half down your ankles, this kind of stuff, that kind of humiliation. But then the sad thing is, I covered then just so many of these things, just again and again and again. You get used to it, so just stop being that way of, just be like, okay, I'll go there, and then hang around with the Mexican Nota Roja, the press that cover the crime scenes. It's like, they get up seeing that, so they hang out and laughing and joking about how you did, and there's always dead bodies there. And I've been to these things where you're there with the dead bodies, and then you go off and then go and eat some steak from some like stall selling kind of steak, and you're kind of eating it with your hands or something. It's a bit like kind of it's a weird situation. So yeah.
Does it ever become normal? Has it become like do you? Because the imagery that you're describing is extremely impactful, and if I stumbled across something like that, it would probably have long-term impact in my mind where I would relive it. But then does it ever become just another murder, just another day, like, or does it ever stop being something like tragic? I don't know. But
it does. Because it does become normal. It does, and it does. You do feel yourself getting cold, and not feeling the sympathy for the people like you should in the same way. Like the first time you think, oh my God, that woman's husband's dead. And then you see it's like, you kind of switch off. You're just doing your job. I saw the most dead bodies I actually seen in one place was in Haiti, because I went there after the earthquake in 2010. So that was just dead bodies everywhere. And that was horrific stuff. That was just bodies all over that city, Port-au-Prince.
Now, Ioan, did you set out to like cover the narco scene, or how did that come about?
Yeah, so no, it wasn't my intention originally. I wanted to get into journalism. So this is going back to the year 2000. I was 27. I'd already messed around for a bit and did various jobs and things, and did university late. So came out of university, wanted to get into journalism. I understood that back then, a route into journalism back then was to work at an English language paper abroad. And I'd already met a few Latin American people traveling. I lived in Spain and really liked the idea of Latin America. Now, I had a bit of a romantic idea about I kind of seen the movie Salvador back in the 80s, So I kind of liked the idea of being James Woods in El Salvador, in Salvador. It's kind of crazy. I mean, maybe that's what I turned into. I don't know. The crazy. He was a photographer.
Mm-hmm.
He's this kind of crazy, burned out photographer running around covering the Civil War. And this kind of romantic idea, but also it was the way the film portrays it by Oliver Stone is the good guys against the bad guys. The good guys, the guerrillas against the bad guys in the military. And you're kind of with the guerrillas and ducking away from the military. And that was kind of my idea. And then so I was looking to Latin America and actually originally was more interested in Colombia or Brazil. I kind of like the idea of the whole, maybe I like the idea of a Brazilian carnival. the images of Brazilian carnival.
Yeah,
that was the kind of stuff that was like, but Portuguese, obviously a different language. At the time, I thought Colombia was a bit too intense, a bit rough. So then I talked to somebody. I found a kind of friend of a friend who'd been in Mexico, and he said, "Go to Mexico. There's and this was when I was trying to first find my way to journalism. It was like trying to how do you get into journalism." And this guy said to me, "You'll get work. You'll find work at the English language paper." So I flew to Mexico with a backpack and a one-way ticket. Spent 4 months teaching English before I got my feet on the ground and got myself, and before I actually got a job in the newspaper, and then started a job in the newspaper in the year 2001. And very quickly, I fell into the crime beat. And a couple of reasons. I mean, it grabbed my attention right away. The kind of stories, cartels, the stories. It grabbed my attention. As a kid, as a teenager, I was into mafia stories and that kind of thing. Into watching mafia documentaries back then, Crime Incorporated. And also another thing was that I connected to this idea of the drug trail because I grew up around a lot of drugs. I grew up in a part of the UK with a huge amount of drug consumption, and I knew several guys, teenagers, young men who died of heroin overdoses when I was growing up. So I kind of connected right away with the whole drug issue. It kind of made sense to me as a issue to cover. And this was then, and then as I started covering this thing, it blew up. So it went from being this kind of crime story to being like a kind of low intensity armed conflict.
Yeah, you mentioned, I guess, the romanticism of Latin America, and I always found these turf wars and all the murders and extremely tragic because Latin America is so beautiful. There isn't a place I've visited in Latin America that I didn't find beautiful. In Argentina, in Brazil, Central America, Panama, Honduras, Guatemala are very beautiful places with beautiful scenery, and it's extremely tragic that these places are going through these problems where it sometimes feels like there's no way out. And seeing all the things that you've seen down there, do you still find beauty in these places in Latin America, in Mexico? Like, if someone asked you to describe Mexico in a few words, what sticks out first? Like the bad stuff, like all this stuff, or the nicer things in Mexico?
No, absolutely. I still find beauty and still love it, and still Mexico, I love it totally. This country, I spent most of my adult life here, and it's beautiful. I wouldn't have been here if it wasn't a wonderful country. It's a wonderful and troubled country, and Latin America is a wonderful but troubled place. I still feel the beauty every time from, and living in Mexico City, you get used to it, and then you still find, wonderful stuff that grab, so you suddenly find some new place you've never eaten, and it's like wonderful food in some, might be just some guy on the street selling stuff, or it might be a high class restaurant. Still find some, go to a market somewhere and it's great, or meet someone or chat to someone. Or Mexico, the country. I mean, it's 2 million square kilometers, and all these villages, and you can just keep on going around and round, and all these places. pyramids, go back to Teotihuacan, the great pyramids of Mexico City. You just go back there again and again, and you have a different experience every time. It's something really, I think, quite spiritual. I mean, I don't want to sound too much like a, hippy dippy on this, but I do feel, those pyramids, something quite spiritual. Going to those places, you feel that connection there, that religious kind of spiritual power there. I think you feel in those places that connection to the past. I love that in England as well. I mean, in England, I love going to a castle in England and that connection to that castle, and it's very, very different. And I think they're two. I mean, two of the most beautiful countries in the world, England and Mexico. So yeah, absolutely. No, if in the first thing, I mean, if the first words, I mean, yeah, no, absolutely. I'd say the good things of Mexico first. I mean, that's tricky when you cover the bad stuff. And some people, people complain. Some people don't like it. Why are you covering the bad things? One time I got, I sat with these people at the Tijuana tourist office. Why are you journalists covering the bad stuff? You're scaring the tourists away. We lost all our tourists. They thought it was like San Diego, just deliberately spreading the bad rumors so that people wouldn't go to Tijuana. Or one time I got called into the Mexican president's office to talk to the president's press guys, and he was like, you're giving us bad press. What are you giving us bad press? And but then but these are real issues. I mean, there is an issue sometimes with sensationalizing things and that kind of bad negative imagery. I can understand that is an issue, but these are real things. These are real problems. So yeah, that's a tough balance sometimes. But this conflict in Mexico is important, not just for what's happened to Mexico. It's important for the United States, and it's important for the world, because we're living in the 21st century, and global organized crime is one of the big issues now in the world. This weird mix of kind of armed conflict and crime is one of the big issues in the world. And the United States is vulnerable to this stuff as well. I mean, the United States has got a lot of problems, a lot of deep problems, I think. A lot of what's happening down here could happen up in the US.
Yeah, and some people feel that what's happening, for example, in Mexico, is a big falls on the United States, because the drugs are consumed up here, and because the guns are coming from up here. And I've spoken to a lot of people in Mexico where they're like, Mexico gets a bad rap, but they feel that the United States plays a big role in that. And unless the United States does something to address these things, Mexico and the rest of Latin America are always going to be in this position where people are suffering and it's not safe, and these turf wars that are out of control. And it seems like the government doesn't have a handle on it, or they're just in on it, right? I'm curious, like, what does the general population feel about Obrador? Like, I remember when I first saw him years ago, like 25 years ago, I thought he was like this hero of the people, right? I remember seeing him at a protest in Veracruz, where they were trying to protect this area of natural water, and some industry was trying to break in there and build things, and they were like, no, we have to protect this source of natural water. And he was there with a bunch of local people, and they were marching, and someone threw a brick at him, and I don't know if you ever saw that scene or have seen the clip. It made the rounds years ago. They threw a brick at him, and it busted his head open, and he just took a handkerchief and held it over and kept marching. He was leading this march, and I was like, this guy's a hero. Like, in Spanish, like, tiene huevos, porque le acaban de partir la cabeza, and he's marching forward, and the people are behind him, and I'm like, this is the hero that people need, right? And then when he made it to the presidency, it was like, wow, he leans to the left, and maybe there's going to be some sort of cultural change. And then, at least the view up here is like, he's like this crazy uncle that, comes over for Thanksgiving, and he's just losing his touch with reality, you know. And when this whole pandemic, he's telling people to hug, and it was just bizarre, right? So what are people thinking of Obrador, and his press conferences in the morning are like it's like a comedy, you know. It's like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, Mexico's 130 million people, so obviously you've always got a big range of opinions there. But overall, his approval ratings are still fairly positive.
Interesting.
And even when you get like in these opinion polls, you'll get like people saying, "Do you think that the government has handled the pandemic well?" And people will say no, but they'll say, "Would you approve of Obrador?" And they'll say yes. So the majority of people still identify with him and identify with this kind of personality, that identity that you stated. A lot of people still feel that. Now, this divides a lot by social class. So his real base and his real bastions are like in the south of Mexico and like Tabasco, Chiapas, and he's got much more support in those places. And in the smaller towns, and when you get to the more educated, urban, cosmopolitan people, they're a lot more critical of him. So it's got that populist thing. Now he plays this role. Now you can compare it to Trump in very, very different ways, but there's comparison.
Totally.
Yeah. I mean, but there's comparison of saying it's the people against the elite. That's the kind of the rhetoric. So he'll bash the press. And have these things, and he'll bash the press and say, and people will identify with him against the press. They'll see the press as these kind of busybodies, and he identifies the regular people against. And that's the game he plays. Now, what do I think personally? Now, a lot of the foreign journalists here are very critical of him all the time. I feel they're critical to the point of they're critical of the point of anything he says, they're going to knock down. It's constantly like attack. So I try to give a bit of space there and try to say now, like, to criticize more when there's real stuff to criticize, but to try and not like criticize anything all the time, and also in terms of his core ideas, I have a certain sympathy for his idea of Mexican nationhood, for his idea of, or his stated idea of, his stated phrase is, work for everybody but the poor first. His idea of kind of return to these values that are a bit lost in this kind of modern he calls it neoliberalism. It's a bit of a catch-all for the whole kind of modern, globalized, changing world, and that loss of core values of kind of family and community and that kind of thing. So I do have a certain sympathy for those. But then again, they also are sometimes, as you say, is like, is he a great administrator? And there's other issues there about corruption. It's this whole thing about, he says he's going to fight corruption. He's going to sweep the stairs from the top down, so you're going to fix corruption at the top first. Mm-hmm. Now, you wonder if that's happening. There's a lot of very suspect people in his party. He's got a lot of flack recently for supporting a candidate for governor of Guerrero who's been accused of rape. And so there's a lot of flack from people and from the feminist movement. And, there's issues about his management of the economy. Now, on the flip side of that, again, and again, look at this more pragmatically, you look around the world today, who's the great world leader? Who's the great country president? What's the great example to look at? Who's the big inspiring example?
Right.
Yeah, okay, you had Trump, real, but now you've got Biden. But I mean, again, he's not exactly an inspiring figure for the history books.
No.
Now it's not as crazy meltdown as when you had Trump in the White House. But then you've got, look around. I mean, back to my country, Boris Johnson. What are you going to look at? Vladimir Putin. You're gonna look at Latin America, Maduro, Nicaragua, in with the government there repressing protesters. So you got a lot of not great options. So within that, how bad is Obrador in that scale? It's kind of pretty, maybe mid-table.
Yeah, and some of those ideals, right? Sometimes I find it kind of comical that people find them radical, right? For example,
Yeah.
um, you know, what's radical about taking care of the poor? I think that a country that has the wealth, that has the resources, should take care of the poor, right? Everyone, and it's a big issue here in the United States, where in the most powerful country, in the richest country, or one of the richest countries in the world, not every citizen has access to healthcare. Like that to me is criminal. And how is it? And some people view that as radical, right? That should not be radical. That everyone has access to free education. Those should not be radical views. Taking care of the poor should not be radical either. And I guess he took a lot of heat for like some of the kooky things that and maybe they were kind of exaggerated, like this thing about he was going to raffle off the presidential plane. Like to this day, I see jokes and memes about that, right? Like it's just super funny. But yeah, and then I believe it was an article you wrote about el presidente abrazador.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
It's like that was like on point, and I thought that maybe he could have done better with addressing the whole pandemic. But Ioan, we have some questions from viewers. If you'd like to take some.
Yeah, please.
So we've got one here, and this one's from Twitter. And RBR Duck 31 is asking, do you suffer from PTSD from your experiences?
Right. Maybe he heard me talking about the. Thank you. Hi over there. Thanks for listening. I certainly suffer, some challenges from the experiences, and from being around, seeing so many dead bodies, being around a bunch of criminals, interviewing them about, some of them telling me that how they decapitate people and they're still alive. Been around some gunfire, not that many times. Been around there's not that many times in Mexico that I'm really there when the bullets are firing, but I have been there a couple of times when that's happened. And generally these kind of situations of tension, these kind of people with traumatic stories. I don't know if I'd call it exact. I mean, it's a certain stress from traumatic situations, but I wouldn't call it a severe PTSD of somebody who's, really, suffering real psychological damage. I don't think I've got that. What I do find sometimes challenging is being around so much death, and I've interviewed a bunch of people who have been murdered, and I've had friends here who have been murdered. It creates a certain. I feel a bit cold now. I find it's hard to be in touch sometimes with my own emotions and kind of process death. I think you start to kind of close off a bit, and that can create some issues. I used to drink quite heavily. I have a bit of that issue with my family of being some. I have some Irish family, so that's the heavy drinkers, and comes with the territory. But so yeah, sometimes especially when you have rum and tequila and stuff down here. But now I try and stick to the beer, so that I find I can't go too badly on beer.
So I was gonna say you haven't stopped. Like, have you stopped drinking? Is that something that?
Nice. I drink. I did actually give up drink for over a year, because I kind of realized it was after one day where I got very drunk and then crashed the car, and then
that'll do it.
That'll do it. Then I got drink for a year, and then since I come back, I've tried to kind of pace it.
Yeah,
pace it.
I usually observe dry January. So like I'll drink during the holidays, and then kind of once New Year's comes around, I kind of just give my liver a break for the entire month of January. But yeah, I think it's good to always be mindful of those things, and I'm glad that and I'm happy that you have it under control, because a couple of times that you were up in New York, we went out to the local Irish pub.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And it was your previous book release was one time,
yeah.
and then another time you were, I think, promoting your other book, and we went out to dinner and had a few drinks. So those conversations that we have are some of the best conversations I've ever had with anyone, and just listening to everything that you've seen, and the fact that you get to document your experiences in books, is like, it's like you're living the dream, right? Like I would love to one day have the opportunity to do things like that, and in another lifetime, my dream was always to also cover uh the war scenes, and be a journalist somewhere where there's turmoil, and be on the ground reporting back to some network, and I live that through you, whenever I see your articles or your books, and the fact that when you're in town, we get to hang out, and I get to hear more of these stories is great. But I took something, that just an idea. Like, I've been journaling things that I work on, just to kind of have something for my children to kind of, or maybe my grandchildren to read. I'll leave these for them, and it'll be like, we'll get to see, or they'll get to read what their crazy grandfather worked on. And some of the things might be like, I used to drive a car with gasoline. Who knows what it'll be when they're around? Like, they'll find that kind of like, wow, they used to drive cars back in the day with gasoline. So yeah, I've been working on things like that, only because, and I don't know if I had a chance to mention this to you before, but I want to say about 2.5 years ago, I had this crazy cancer scare.
Oh no, I didn't know about that. No.
Yeah, and so it totally changed my perspective on life, and having two small boys who are 7 and 4 now. Long story short, I was not feeling right from my stomach. Went to the doctor. He's like, well, you're really young to have a colonoscopy, but let's go ahead and do it, because just to play it safe. So went and had a colonoscopy, and they pulled out a 55 millimeter polyp from my large intestine, basically the size of a golf ball.
Wow.
And so when I came through, the doctor was like, yeah, everything's fine, except that we just, and he had it in a jar, and he's showing it to me, and it's the size of a golf ball. And he's like, we got to send this off to the lab. And so basically it was precancerous. He said, if you would have waited to 50, he goes, well, basically you would have made it to 50. The cancer would have spread to your body, and you wouldn't be around. So to hear at age 45 that I would not have made it to 50, is like, hits you like a ton of bricks. And since then, you hear the cliche, right, that life is really short, but in essence, it can end at any minute, at any second, right? And doing the work that you do, I mean, you're putting yourself out there every day, and it's dangerous work, but I think it needs to, that story of what's happening down there needs to be told, and you have a really, really up close perspective on it, and the fact that you're leaving these books for future generations to look back on. I mean, I don't know if you see it the way I see it, but you're doing a service to humanity and future generations to come, when hopefully when Mexico comes out of this, we can still go back to these books, and kind of learn from history.
Yeah, I mean, the books have been a wonderful thing, and I've been in the media doing journalism for 20 years, and the books have been the best side of that. And it's the communication. When I get an email from somebody, all kinds of different people, all kinds of walks of life. So that I read the book, it meant something to me. I had one email from a guy who was a a nurse in England during COVID. He got COVID, and he was quarantining for a couple of weeks. And he said he read my book and watched Tiger King, and that kind of helped him get through it. So it meant a lot to him. But all kinds of people all around the United States, cops, trainee cops, students, old men, women who have, with family in these places, who are living in the US and connecting back, guys who hire undocumented Mexicans in their farms who want to understand what's happening and the things that, so all kinds of people, readers here, I've been pleased to also have a readership in Mexico itself, and some good academics here, reading the stuff and feeding back to me. So it means a lot to me. Yeah, I mean, when you're with that bug where you've got to write, you've got to do that, and there's something in your body making you do that. It's kind of, you got to go with it, and it's like a gift, and at the same time, a gift with some rough sides. You can't just relax and just make some cash and be safe. You've got to be out there doing stuff and telling stuff. You've got to find some kind of outlet, and I've always had that kind of drive to do that and to kind of interact with stuff and to get this feedback. And books is still a nice form. I mean, we live in the crazy world of Twitter and stuff. So Twitter kind of gives you that. You think you're fulfilling sometimes, or that same urge to communicate and get stuff out there, but it's also a very poisonous medium, Twitter. Mm-hmm. People can get yourself fired, get yourself in just fights with people. You're not really producing anything of great kind of art or worth. I mean, some people are good at Twitter and they create their base there, but it's a kind of poisonous medium, whereas a book's a much purer thing, and and you really pour your heart out into that. I mean, I say with books, I have three objectives. I got to try and communicate with the reader, just like tell them a good story, and then I've got to try and change something in the reader's thinking, and then also try and impact the debate. What the book's about. So try and impact the debate about these things. And I look a lot about the story. How do you tell stories? How do you communicate? How do you? And I look. I mean, I think we all look to our own roots about storytelling. I look to pubs, back home, friends back home, sitting around, getting stoned as teenagers and just telling stories, just telling crazy shit. Mm-hmm. Or I have cousins. Go back to Ireland. I have cousins in Ireland, and one time I went to visit him, and I've been for a few years already doing stuff in Mexico, and he was like, "Hey, come over," and he was like, and I was sitting in the pub, one of his local pubs. This is a town of 4,000 people with 90 pubs, and I was telling him, and he was saying, "Oh, it's my cousin here. He's working as a journalist in Mexico." And I'd tell him some story, and he'd turn around to the next guy and go, "Ha!" And he'd start retelling the anecdotes to the next guy in the pub. And the way he retold the anecdotes, the things that he chose, the details that he chose, were the ones I realized that I had to tell people, because that he was translating what is a crazy world to something the guy next to him in the pub, who's like a builder in the pub in Westport Island, can understand.
Now, do people back home know about your work? Like, does your town know that their town's own is across the pond, writing books and covering this narco scene, and is a writer for the New York Times and is always on all the major media outlets? Like, do they know this about you?
I mean, thanks for looking at it that way. And it's, it doesn't always, seen that way. I mean, for me, my days and weeks are still just on the hustle, getting by, getting paid. And, I'm a freelance journalist when it comes down to it. But I mean, for old school friends and stuff, they'll suddenly come back, "Oh, I saw you on TV. I saw you on this." And, people will see that. And, I think people like it. I think it sounds good. But it's not like I'm some kind of there's not going to build a statue to me in my town. I mean, Alfredo Corchado, who's a fellow journalist, if you know, he's a guy from El Paso. I think they literally named some place after him in like, and he's a legend, but he's a lot more. He's very, very embraced by his community. And he's been close. He grew up, I think, between California and then like Texas, and then he's born in Durango, and he's very much bounced back and forth, and he's very much embraced in his community. So I wouldn't say anything of like that. But yeah, I mean, you know, some friends, some of my friends have said like, you know, looks good.
So then there's no renaming of Main Street in your town for Ioan Grillo Drive or Road or.
I've got my have to do something a bit bigger before I can get that one done.
Or even like let's say if corridos was a thing, like el corrido de Ioan Grillo in the UK.
In the UK, yeah. Well, I mean, talking about corridos, there's
you have a corrido? There's a corrido about
not about me. There's a journalist, the guy I mentioned, Jesus Blanconelas. He has a corrido about him.
Wow.
El Periodista is like a corrido about him. So that's gonna be. I'm trying to think of other journalists. I wonder if Javier Valdez, the journalist Javier Valdez, who was a journalist, who was a friend as well, and a journalist who was murdered in Culiacan in 2017. I wonder if there's any corridos about him. I don't know. I mean, he got killed by drug cartel guys, and it's a tragic thing.
So we have another comment from Facebook coming in, and let's see if so this is Ivan Vasquez, and we're sending a big hello and shout out to Ivan. He's in Mexico City, and he says, why does the Border Patrol use all its resources to prevent people from entering, but not to prevent weapons from leaving? I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, somebody's got to be letting these guns out, and I guess someone on the other side is letting them in. But I'd have to assume that Border Patrol agents are in on it as well.
So, I mean, first of all, there are Border Patrol which are corrupt. There's American officials that are corrupt in different ways. I mean, there was like a police chief of a town in New Mexico who was working with gun traffickers. And he was even informing on the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms and Explosives, the ATF. He was informing on their operations to the gun traffickers. He was the mayor of Columbus, New Mexico. I interviewed a guy who was a working laying cable. He had official government pass, and he went over to Mexico and was trafficking guns. So there's corruption on both sides of the border. Overall, I saw the number today, something like 140,000 vehicles going to Mexico every day. So it is not practical to be able to stop and search all the vehicles the same way it isn't practical to stop and search all the vehicles going into the US. That's why drugs make it into the US and guns go south. But what the US fails to do is what it fails to do miserably, it doesn't really try, is it allows these guns to be sold to the criminals in the first place. Now, there's different ways that happen. One way is you go to some of these gun shows, and there's private sellers who say they're just collectors, but they've got piles of new guns, and they're selling them with no paper trail at all, and they're selling like piles of AR-15s, AK-47s, no paper trail at all. Now that will be stopped with the universal background check, but then the NRA was always opposing that. So that's one of these things of America, because of the gun culture thing, opposing that. Now, I do believe myself, and I argue this in the book. Look, I'm not against American Second Amendment, and I respect the rights of U.S. citizens to have guns. I don't get really deep into that argument. But within that, respecting the Second Amendment of the United States, there's a whole bunch of things that could be done to stop these guns going to the cartels. I mean, you've got situations where people are buying single people are buying 500 guns, and they're being taken to criminals. You've got people walking into a shop and buying. You've got supposed housewives buying 6 Barrett 50s, 50 cals, paying in cash. I mean, these things would be setting off alarm bells. But the fact that they're allowing all this stuff to happen is where the error is taking place, and where they could, with an effort, with a political will, they could stop.
Yeah, it's really incredible. Prior to the pandemic, when we were actually having mass shootings at schools and at nightclubs and things like that in the US, 18 out of the 19 mass shootings were committed by guns that were purchased legally. Because there's a big debate, right? With regards to, well, if you ban all sorts of assault type rifles or things like that, it's still going to get in the hands of people who want to commit these crimes. But and then there was also another crazy statistic where it was 15 out of the last 19 mass shootings were committed by people who were on the no-fly list, right? People who had documented mental illness, and it's I don't understand why people who are diehard Second Amendment people have a problem with stricter background checks. Right.
Well, some of them don't, and I did try to, bring this up. I mean, in the book, I also interview, the head of the AR-15 owners of America, the head of the Alaska Machine Gun Association, a guy from a militia called the Michigan Liberty Militia. I interviewed. I got in touch with them through Facebook when they still were allowed militia Facebook groups before they were all taken down. So I did bash this out with them and bring this stuff to them. Now, some of them actually, when I say to them, but would you be down with some of these simple measures to just stop these guns going to criminals? And they're like, yeah, I'll be okay with that. So some of them are up for compromise. Now, some of them aren't. Some of them, the militia guy, this is what I call Second Amendment fundamentalism. I mean, a very fundamental interpretation of a Second Amendment, even to the point of thinking, well, maybe even criminals should be allowed guns. I mean, but some people are up for a compromise. But one of the things that has really held this up is the NRA. Now, the NRA has got a weird history. You go all the way back, and the NRA were not, they were originally formed in New York, and they were formed by a guy who worked at the New York Times, and they were by guys who fought in the North in the Civil War. And they wanted just to practice straight shooting, and they were in favor for many, many years in favor of sensible gun regulations. But then you got this radical wing takeover under a guy called Harlan Carter from Texas, who was a guy who, when he was 17 years old in Laredo, Texas, he shot dead a 15-year-old Mexican teenager. And it was to do with, he'd been seen loitering on the street, and his mum accused him of stealing the car, and he went out with a gun and he shot this guy called Ramon Casiano. His name is, going many, many years back. This guy, Harlan Carter, became very radical and changed the organization and said it was against any kind of reform, and it became a real fanatic support among some people. And then I think what happened is they turned into a kind of a money-making machine that made money actually a lot from the membership themselves. So it was a lot of the members themselves paying them money, and through the kind of creating their own media empire. I mean, they had NRA TV with these really big celebrities on NRA TV. And what they sold was this no compromising culture war position of saying, no, we've got to fight this. They're going to take our guns. And that's the kind of thing they sold, and they had to have that position of constantly fighting all the time. I think that's a part of it, because why are they against background checks. I mean, yeah, it's kind of doesn't. I mean, because even in the surveys, there's a survey that found 89% of Americans overall are in favor of universal background checks. 81% of conservatives and the majority of gun owners are in favor of universal background checks. So why are the NRA opposing this stuff?
And one of the arguments I heard on the side of those that oppose it is that it was somehow a bridge to stricter laws. So they're like afraid, well, that's the first step. They're going to make it even harder. And then,
that's what Harlan Carter, he introduced that idea very much. He said it's a bit like this person eating a packet of potato chips, and you eat one, and then you don't want to have another one. You have another until you finish the packet, right. And it's just like every step is incremental. That's where you have to fight an unceasing war. That's the idea that it's the grab our guns thing. We can't come to any compromise, and that's the part of the thing. But when you get deep into the gun legislation, you realize there's so many weird things. It's a real mess, gun legislation in the US. I mean, a mess from, it's like you've got the gun safety or gun control side, you've got the gun rights side, and there's these kind of weird compromises that made that which kind of pissed them both off. One of the weird things that I found, I went to the National Trace Center in West Virginia, where all the guns that are found at crime scenes or whatever, they're traced, or with criminals, they're traced through this center. Now, there's a weird thing that many police themselves in America don't know. If you go to a murder scene and find a smoking gun, literally a smoking gun, and you look at the serial number and you call up the trace center and go, give me a trace. And the trace center says, we're not allowed by law to digitally trace that gun. We have to do it manually, phoning up the gun manufacturer, then phoning up who they sold it to, then who they sold it to. Average trace time 11 days in a murder scene. If you see a license plate of a car, bang in the computer, you know it is. But it's literally a smoking gun at a crime scene. They're legally not allowed by law to trace it.
Incredible. Now, what about legalizing drugs, right? Like, because for example, using the same analogy about, like, I remember growing up, weed, right? Weed was supposed to be the bridge to heavier drugs or more dangerous drugs. But I remember in Mexico, a lot of the politicians and legislators were considering legalizing certain drugs. Is that possibly the answer to this whole problem? Like, if you make it legal, then what are these guys fighting for?
I think it's part of the solution. I mean, when I say legalizing drugs, I use the term drug policy reform. So if you look before you had the war on drugs as defined by like Richard Nixon back in 1971. And Richard Nixon said, we're going to have this battle which will abolish heroin from American life. There'll be no heroin in American life. It just won't be there. Now, 50 years later, it's exactly 50 years, 2021, we've got record overdose deaths in the United States. So that's obviously been a failure of that attempt to stop the whole drug trade has been a failure. But the idea of fully legalizing, like marijuana, now we can legalize that. I think now we kind of, that conversation has been had. And now you've got, even like in like Mississippi, they legalized medical marijuana, and that was voted with a big majority in Mississippi. So like now, in terms of legalizing marijuana, in fact, in Mexico is about to legalize marijuana here as well. There was just a vote in Congress today, or yesterday. There was a vote in Congress, and they passed the legalization of marijuana. They've got to go through the Senate, and then President sign it, and then they can legalize marijuana in Mexico federally. So we can, I think, move forward, push this forward, and create a legal marijuana market in the whole of North America. But how do we deal with heroin, crystal meth, cocaine? I don't know about that. It's tough. Mm-hmm. We need to start having that conversation now, I think. Discuss that. One starting point is people need help. Now, according to the American Medical Association, of only 10% of the people who need addiction help get the help they need. So 90% are not getting addiction help. So we've got to try and find ways of giving people help, getting them off the heroin, which they're spending money on, which is in going to the cartels and committing murder. But I do think that America's drug problem and the global drug problems right now are connected to some quite deep disillusionments and problems with society, which are tough to solve. But we've got to try and address that.
Yeah, I always firmly believe that part of this, or a big part of it, is addressing the addiction problem. And I think if maybe here in the United States, if we focused or used our resources in addressing the addiction problem, then that would, I think, change the whole the whole scene of all these things that have been happening for a very long time. It's got to be there. If you have no demand, then there's no business. And then part of it, I guess, is also um, legalizing weed. I think that is also a step in the right direction. But I agree with you. Crystal meth, cocaine, and heroin. I mean, those are very, very different than weed, and that is a huge problem that's going to require a lot of thought, a lot of planning. And but yeah, Johan, it's always a pleasure. I've taken already a little bit over an hour of your time, and it's always great when we conversate. I can't wait for this pandemic to be officially over, right? I think the vaccine is a big component of this, to go back to the life we knew before the pandemic. Because I'm dying to travel and go back to Mexico, and then maybe meet up and go to an antro or a cantina and catch up and down a few cold ones or a few pints. Because I miss Mexico, I miss Puebla, I miss my friends, I miss my family, and I'm dying to see them all. And so I want to thank you so much for taking the time. I want to thank you for sharing your insight, and we recommend that everyone check out this book. It's available at Amazon, at Barnes and Noble, and the bookshop. And muchas gracias. Always a pleasure catching up with you.
It's fantastic. Un abrazo fuerte. And yeah, absolutely. Like next time you're in Mexico, definitely let's meet up, go for some beers. Do it in Puebla. It's just down the road, as you know. Or next time I'm in New York. I mean, yeah, I really wish I was on the road, with this book. You mentioned that last time when I presented Gangster Warlords, we got pretty hammered, as you said. And the next day I had to go and get a plane in Newark. And I remember going with a really horrible hangover to Newark Airport. I remember getting on a plane. I don't remember when I was going. I think it was down in Houston. So yeah, it'd be great to see you again. And yeah, let's keep the conversation. Thanks much for bringing me on the show.
No, I appreciate it. And again, for those who, this is the book right here, Blood, Gun, Money. Make sure you check it out. It just grabs you from that first episode. I mean, I open the book and I see the guns of El Chapo, and I'm like, this is great. And once you start, you can't stop. And thank you so much, Ioan. All the best to you and the family. Please stay safe out there, and hopefully we can do this in person next time.
Absolutely. Take care, man.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for tuning in. We will be back next week with another exciting episode and another great guest. But again, I want to remind you to please go out and check out this book. It's available at Amazon, at the bookshop, and Barnes and Nobles. The name of the book is Blood, Gun, Money by our good friend, Ioan Grillo. Muchas gracias, and I'll see you all in the promised land.